All right, in this explainer, we're going to be looking at a text that outlines 4 specific categories of sexual sins as condemned by the Bible. What's really interesting here is that this source actually ranks them by how serious they are, building up to what it considers the absolute most severe. And the consequences are described as being both spiritual and physical. So let's dive in.
So that brings us to the big question, right? What actions aren't just seen as forbidden, but as profoundly, deeply destructive? We're going to walk through these 4 sins, kind of like a countdown, and we'll end with what this particular text describes as the most severe one of all.
But first, we've got to understand the foundation this is all built on. This whole perspective starts from the idea that sexuality was created by God to be something sacred and pure, not just a physical act. And it was intended exclusively for one context, the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman. This verse from Genesis, it's presented as the absolute cornerstone for that entire framework. The text uses it to say, see, marriage is the designated, God-ordained place for sexual intimacy. So from this viewpoint, any deviation from that is seen as a distortion of the original design. And here, this warning from the Apostle Paul is used to really set the stage. This passage is highlighted to argue that sexual sins are uniquely damaging. The idea is that they're an offense against your own body, which makes them fundamentally different from other kinds of mistakes. So, first up on the list is adultery. The definition is pretty straightforward: a married person having sexual relations with someone who isn't their spouse. It's described as a profoundly destructive act, something with the power to completely shatter the sacred bonds of a family. Now, this quote shows a really key expansion of that idea. The text points to Jesus' words right here to argue that the sin of adultery gets elevated from just a physical act to a matter of what's inside, your internal desire. In this view, the transgression actually begins in the heart, long before any action ever takes place. So, what's the fallout? Well, the text lays out these 3 major consequences. The story of King David and Bathsheba is used as the classic example. Their affair led to deception, murder, and just widespread turmoil, which really illustrates the destructive ripple effects. Okay, the second sin that's discussed is fornication. This one's defined really broadly. It's basically any sexual relationship that happens outside of marriage. And the source makes a point of saying that while this is treated with huge seriousness in the Bible, it's become much more common and accepted in today's society. This verse from Hebrews is presented as a pretty direct warning. The text frames fornication not just as an act, but as a failure to honor the institution of marriage itself. It's viewed as a defilement of something that's meant to be kept pure. According to the source, these are the key spiritual and emotional dangers. The argument is basically that when you separate sex from the commitment of marriage, you corrupt the divine purpose of intimacy. This leads to things like superficial relationships, and over time, it can harden a person's heart toward God's teachings. The third category on our list covers prostitution and what the text calls unbridled lust. These 2 are linked together and condemned for destroying the sanctity of the body. And here's a fascinating angle. They're also framed as a type of idolatry, where pleasure itself becomes the ultimate god. Wow. This quote from the book of Proverbs is used to paint a really stark, really vivid picture. Prostitution isn't just seen as a transaction here. It's depicted as a deadly spiritual trap that leads its victims down a path toward destruction and death. So here are the stated outcomes. On an individual level, it's described as the cycle of emptiness that just enslaves the soul. But on a societal level, the text claims it corrupts values and tears families apart. This is all then linked back to spiritual unfaithfulness against God, with references to the book of Hosea. And that brings us to the final and, according to this perspective, the absolute most severe category of sins. These are presented as practices that represent a total breakdown of morality and a violation of the natural order that God established. The 2 practices that are placed in this final category are incest and bestiality. The material defines them very clearly. Incest is sexual relations between close relatives, and bestiality is sexual relations between a human and an animal, and both are classified with a very strong term, abominations. So, to explain why these acts are condemned so strongly, this perspective points right to the book of Leviticus. The text there warns against these things explicitly, and it even uses the word confusion to describe them as a violation of the fundamental boundaries of creation itself. So why are these ranked as the absolute worst? Well, the argument is that they completely distort the divine order of relationships. The text also points to what it calls irreversible consequences, like potential genetic issues from incest. And it claims these acts attract a direct divine curse, citing biblical examples like the story of Lot's daughters. Now, after laying out this whole hierarchy of sins, from adultery all the way to what it calls the ultimate taboos, the material completely pivots. It asks a really fundamental question. After all of that condemnation, is there any path to forgiveness? Is redemption even possible? And this final section is all about answering that very question. The argument that's presented is that no matter how severe the sin, the path to forgiveness is always, always open through genuine repentance and a true desire for restoration. This verse is held up as the core promise of that forgiveness. It's a really powerful counterpoint to all the warnings that came before it. The message here is that confession and repentance can actually lead to cleansing and a completely fresh start, no matter what happened in the past. The text closes out its argument with this key story from the New Testament. Remember when the religious leaders brought a woman caught in adultery to Jesus? He offered her grace instead of condemnation. But, and this is crucial, that forgiveness came with a command, go and sin no more. It pairs grace with a call for real transformation. So the material we've just walked through presents these biblical passages as timeless warnings, basically viewing modern society as just repeating ancient mistakes. And that leaves us with a final question to think about. What does this kind of perspective reveal about the ongoing dialogue and, let's be honest, the sometimes serious tension between the moral frameworks of ancient texts and the values of our modern world?